Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. Can everybody hear me okay? I get a thumbs up or a Chris, can you confirm? Oh,
Hear you loud and
okay.
clear.
Thank you so much. Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. It's my honor to be here on behalf of the Worker Solidarity Network. I'm really excited to see some friendly names from the climate justice movement and from IBEW. So before we get started, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm emceeing this event remotely from the unceded territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, specifically on Songhees and Esquimalt nations. I think that there will be a link in the chat to a navigational map for folks to identify whose territories they're on. And I encourage folks to do that either now or later, as I think it's really important for that knowledge to ground the work that we do in the social, labor, and climate justice movements, to recognize the original stewards of the lands and waters, and our roles in making sure that we incorporate Indigenous justice in the movement work that we do. So we'll just jump right in. As I'm sure all of you can relate, we've been feeling the impacts of the climate crisis in BC for years, and it's getting worse every winter and every summer with fires and the heat dome and atmospheric rivers. I can say personally, I have a lot of family that works in healthcare, and especially with the heat dome and with the smoke in the hospitals, it's been really traumatic for a lot of the frontline workers in that sector, and I know people feel it across sectors. Simultaneously, the federal government is finally in the process of passing sustainable jobs legislation, which will hopefully set the framework for what work will look like as we transition away from fossil fuels and towards a more livable future. The government has convened a series of regional tables to talk to various levels of government, including Indigenous governments and communities, labor, industry, and other bodies about regional planning for the energy transition. However, so far, the plan unfortunately does not include many opportunities to hear from workers in climate and transition impacted sectors. In order for a just and equitable transition, a future that's livable for all of us, decisions and planning need to be guided by the experiences and perspectives of the people who are going to be the most impacted. This includes Indigenous people and communities and all of us who are working to support our families and communities. People and communities are going to bear the brunt of the work needed to transition, and we deserve to be a part of building the plan that will take us into a zero carbon or low carbon future. So that's why we're here today. First, we'll hear from a panel of workers about what their work looks like now and what changes they can see coming, as well as their hopes for how their work and their communities will transform as we transition away from fossil fuels. This conversation does not represent all sectors, but it'll be an important starting point for these public conversations. Then, if we have time, it will be time to take action to ensure, or if we have time, we'll pose some questions, to the panel of workers. And following that discussion, it'll be time to take action to ensure that our decision makers heed the perspectives and needs articulated by the folks here with us this evening. So tonight we're joined by 4 workers. I apologize if I mispronounce anyone's name at all. First, we have Ivan Drury, a Handy Dart transit driver in Vancouver, Cliff Madsen with Unifor Local 2301 in aluminum smelting, Byron Cruz, an migrant worker organizer, and Mike Fancy, who works for Yukon Fire. So each of these folks will be responding to 4 questions. The first is, what does your sector and your work currently look like? Then what changes do you anticipate or are you already experiencing because of the energy transition or climate change? What are your hopes for yourself, your colleagues, and your community in the future as we transition away from fossil fuels? And what do you want your elected representatives to know as they build plans for a transition? So I will turn it over to Cliff Madsen to start us off. Perfect. So Cliff has worked in, just a quick intro. Cliff has worked for 42 years at the aluminum smelter in Kitimat, formerly owned by Alcan, now owned by Rio Tinto, if I'm saying that right. He has worked in most senior leadership positions for his union over the years, including chair of the OHS&E committee, chair of the grievance committee, different executive positions, and now as business agent. He was appointed as the BC Regional Council Delegate to Unifor's Climate Action Task Force and is currently Secretary Treasurer on the Unifor Mining / Smelting Sector Executive Council, or Council Executive, sorry. Thank you, Cliff.
Thank you, Cassidy, and good evening to everybody. Did you want me to just go ahead and speak to each of the questions?
Absolutely. Thank you, Cliff.
Okay, so the first question that was put to me was, what does your sector and your work currently look like? So I work, as was stated, in the aluminum smelter business, I guess you could say. So the Kitimat smelter is the only smelter in British Columbia, and there are others in Quebec, owned by Rio Tinto and others. So the current demand for aluminum is slack. This is primarily in view of the slow recovery of the global economy. To give you some context, the current price per ton is $2,100 US, and the average for 2023 is forecasted to be approximately $2,365 US per ton. Our industry is heavily impacted by a number of different factors, not the least of which is the contribution that China makes to the market, both in terms of their own consumption and their export. So China by far is the largest producing country in the world. 10 to 15 years ago, when China was building new cities and the like as their economy was growing, they were pretty much consuming all the aluminum that they were producing. They continue to open new smelters, and then what we've seen happen in the last 15 years is a slowing of the building of the new cities, so to speak. And we've also started to see some of the potential impact that the younger Chinese population, who are questioning the impact on climate and so on, and pressuring their own governments in terms of the way that they generate electricity, which is almost 100% using coal. And of course, coal and the byproducts that it burns off in the environment do contribute significantly to global warming. It's yet to be seen whether the Chinese reliance on this coal-generated power and climate change issues will force any sort of lasting curtailment on their aluminum production, because they have the ability to really negatively affect the market prices, and thus the producers in North America are obviously affected by that. Other factors, current factors that we're dealing with, the Russian war with the Ukraine, this has left the markets with a lot of unrest. On the one hand, there is restricted raw materials coming out of Russia that many of the other countries use to produce aluminum. But on the other hand, this has caused increased cost for producers. But on the other hand, there's been a restricted flow of the Russian processed aluminum into the world economy, which has meant that it's had a kind of a balancing effect on the market. In terms of, aluminum, generally speaking, aluminum is viewed as a favorable metal, especially moving forward as we see the electrification of transportation. And that's, of course, going to grow and grow and grow. And aluminum in bauxite is actually the most abundant metal on the Earth's crust. So the forecasts are that there's at least 100 years worth of bauxite still to be mined. So there's no, immediate impact in terms of that raw material. And aluminum, it's considered a very light metal, but from the perspective of strength versus weight, it's very, very favorable. And so therefore, use in lightening the weight of vehicles while keeping the strength of their bodies and frames and so on makes it a very attractive metal for that purpose. So that's a little bit about what the aluminum sector looks like. Next question was, what changes do I anticipate or are we already experiencing because of the energy transition or climate change? So a few points there. We have been experiencing low water conditions in British Columbia now for a number of years. We're located in northern British Columbia, so we still do get a lot of rain and so on, but our snowpack and whatnot that basically fills the reservoir that powers our power plant, that reservoir has been, lower in recent years, and it's starting to raise. People are raising their hand, and they're worried about it. So reservoir management has become very tricky for the employer. Water has become a precious commodity as it does fuel our hydroelectric production, and it's a key factor in our site remaining economical. The second point I would make is that the government of British Columbia has initiated their carbon tax strategy. So they're currently in discussions with industries in our province to arrive at a new output-based pricing system, OBPS, which would take effect in 2014. So depending on the model that is finally arrived at, our site will experience significant taxation, which will now reflect not only our combustibles, but will also include our process consumption as well. And this is a change from what we're currently taxed at. Currently, we're taxed just on our combustibles. So this would be like the vehicles on site, burning fuel, this sort of thing. And for our plant, it represents about 8% of the total contribution to global warming, I guess you could say. It's through the vehicles and the machines that burn fossil fuels. Once that shifts to include the process consumption of carbon, in our case, it's going to be a huge difference. Just to give you a bit of context, so to generate or to produce 1 ton of aluminum, that energy that's used is about 16 tons of CO2. For 1 ton of aluminum, 16 tons of CO2, and 16 tons of CO2 is around the equivalent of burning 5 tons of oil. So in our case, 5 tons of oil to make 1 ton of aluminum, and our plant makes 420,000 tons of aluminum. So it's a huge amount of CO2 that's being generated. And once the government starts to tax that, it's going to be have a big impact on the bottom line in Kitimat and other aluminum smelters in Canada. So the other changes, I guess, that I'll just mention is that with the electric vehicle expansion, this is obviously going to create real opportunities for our sector. And I know that, the not only Kitimat, but other producers are looking to capitalize on this need for lightweight materials to go into those vehicles. Okay, so the next question was, what are my hopes for myself, my colleagues, and my community in the future as we transition away from fossil fuels? So you may or may not be aware, Rio Tinto has partnered with Alcoa, which is an American aluminum company, and to a lesser degree, Apple, in developing a new technology called ELYSIS. So this technology would have the effect of taking all of the carbon out of aluminum smelting and replacing that with new technology, which basically is a ceramic. So that would be an awesome thing for everybody involved. My hope is that the new ELYSIS technology will become commercially viable, eliminating all the direct greenhouse gas emissions from the aluminum smelting process. And then from there, I hope that our Kitimat smelter is not only the recipient of the new technology, but that we end up actually producing and repairing the ceramic anodes that I mentioned at our site here in Kitimat. We have that capacity to do that because we have the land, we have the power, and we have an ice free port that would all accommodate that type of thing as it currently accommodates our aluminum smelter. When we modernized the smelter in 2015, the old footprint was left there. That's all being demolished and taken down, and that's going to leave a huge swath of land for the company to entertain bringing that type of operation to our town. And that is going to also play into the just transition because there will be an effect on the existing smelter should we move to that new technology. Also, as we transition away from fossil fuels and we move to electrified transportation, I would like to see our power generating capacity in Camano, which is a neighboring community just down the ocean away, and that's where we get our power. I'd like to see that particular operation, which is also owned by Rio Tinto, expanded such that the excess power that could be generated there could be used in the province to basically deliver the extra power that's going to be needed as we move to this electrification. I don't know how many people have actually thought about it, but if every household in the province had a charging station and was running electric transportation, I don't believe that we currently have the necessary electricity to basically fuel that. Or if we do, it's not leaving a lot else for any other type of development. So the Camano facility, which we also represent, those are our members. And of course, there would be potential for us to grow our membership there while providing a clean energy source for the province. So then the final question that we were asked to talk about was sort of what do we want our elected representatives to know as they build plans for a transition? So I gave this a lot of thought, and I thought about, changes to this world with what's coming and what it's going to take to actually be successful getting where we need to get to. So what I would like my elected representatives in government to understand is that this transition is necessary for our world to survive as we know it. And everybody needs to get on board to make this not only happen, but happen in a good way. Governments in partnership with industry and stakeholders will need to work collaboratively as this task is a big one. And although there will be, different sides of the discussions, I think that the goals need to be clear and everyone needs to win in the end. So this isn't a scenario where, one side or the other side's coming out puffing their chest, because I just don't think that's going to get it done. I think it's going to be more about the collaborative approach and getting to a goal that's not only important for all the directly affected people, but also in the interest of our province and our country and ultimately our world. So above all, there needs to be a just transition, and that this not be on the backs of workers. We've made that clear with our employer. Government and industry will need to understand that workers can't be left behind, and that they will need to have creative vision to ensure that there is a clear plan for workers in the event that their jobs disappear through this transition. I'm happy to say that in my local, we were able to negotiate a just transition letter, which I believe is the first one in my union. And basically it's a no job loss document with a number of options for workers and for the employer to involve government and others. But there would be no jobs lost with the implementation of that new ELYSIS technology in Kitimat. So I think that's the type of commitment and a type of vision that people affected are going to need to understand is there for them. because otherwise it's going to be a very tough task getting to where we need to get to. Thank you very much. Back to you, Cassidy.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure if I can turn my video on. It's not letting me here, but yeah, thank you so much, Cliff. I really appreciated your comments, especially around how you have capacity. Oh, there we go. Capacity where you're working now to take on the ELYSIS, if I'm saying that right, the ceramics work. So that, like you said, there's no jobs lost, but also that those jobs stay union jobs. So that's really great to hear. So our next speaker, I'll just introduce quickly, Byron Cruz. Byron arrived in Canada 30 years ago, fleeing persecution for resisting inequity, injustice, and state violence in Guatemala. Currently, he is the organizer and the coordinator of BC Federation of Labor's Occupational Health and Safety Center's Migrant Worker Program in Vancouver. He's also an active member of the Sanctuary Health Collective, a grassroots collective that gives direct support, advocates, and organizes with migrant families with precarious or no immigration status for access for all services based on need and not on immigration status. Byron organizes with the Migrants' Rights Network in BC and National Migrants' Rights Network to raise awareness about the issues faced by migrant communities and to ensure that temporary farm workers and undocumented communities have access to services and dignified working conditions. His own journey organizing to address injustice and inequities in Guatemala and his journey of migration ground his commitment to build a society rooted in equity, racial justice, and dignity. So I'll pass it over to you, Byron. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassidy. And I'm joining from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and thankful for the opportunity that our brothers and sisters give to us to be able to be here in Canada as migrants, as refugees, and to see the possibility of working together. I'm from Guatemala. Guatemala is also historically part of Turtle Islands. And then as a result of that, our commitment is to stand in resistance, in solidarity with our sisters and brothers from the local First Nations. And thank you, Cassidy, and nice to have a great group of panelists. And as worker with the BC Federation of Labor, the Health and Safety Center, I have the opportunity to work with agricultural migrant workers and also with undocumented workers in the construction sector. And in terms of the agricultural migrant workers, who are they or where they are coming from? Well, the agricultural migrant workers basically are two different programs. And one of the programs is it's basically an agreement between government of Canada and government of Mexico, for example. And that's the seasonal agricultural workers program, where workers come from Mexico, for example, for periods of 3 to 8 months every year, every season. They might be going to a different province next year. Some will come back to BC. And also there is another program where people are coming with contracts that are between the employer and some of the recruitment, with the recruitment agencies in different countries. Both programs, basically between the two programs, provide more than 10,000 agricultural migrant workers in British Columbia. Not so sure in Canada, probably around 60,000 in Canada. And basically, recently, I was checking one of the one of the documents from United Nations where a representative from United Nations came and met with different organizations. And basically, the document says that this program is exploited program. We knew that. It's nice that at least United Nations is recognizing that there is a exploitive nature on this program, where 80% of migrant workers are living in precarious housing, where there is a constant violation of their working rights. And basically, these agricultural migrant workers are coming from also countries where they have already suffered displacement, right? Where Canada has 80-90% of investment of the mining companies in our countries, where Canada does not follow the regulations, and when they are causing displacement and death of our people, in our territories. And many of the agricultural migrant workers are indigenous. They are coming from indigenous territories from Guatemala and Mexico, and they are also coming from Jamaica. Lots of workers are also coming from Vietnam and other Caribbean countries. And many of the challenges that the agricultural migrant workers are facing, and listen to this, right? It's like I'm mentioned in the name agricultural migrant workers. Technically, the government does not call them migrant workers, even when migrant workers have been coming for more than 4 decades. Mexican workers, you can easily talk to them in the Okanagan. They have been coming for 4 decades, for more than 40 years, coming to Canada with not even the right to be called migrant worker. And because they call temporary migrant workers, but they came here, they lost their family, they lost the opportunity to be with their kids, they lost the opportunity to grow up with their community, and we exploit them. And then agricultural migrant workers are being affected by climate changes, and since a few years ago, we have been witnessing the floodings, for example, in the Fraser Valley a couple years ago, and who are the most vulnerable workers in the floodings, right? When we realized that agricultural migrant workers were displaced in hundreds during the floodings in the Fraser Valley, and with no proper information, finally some shelters were available for them. And also recently we had this situation with the fires in Kelowna, and approximately 600 agricultural migrant workers were displaced, and they were sent to other farms. And during this displacement, many workers lost their belongings. In the Fraser Valley, many workers lost their belongings. In Kelowna as well, many workers lost their belongings. The workers also lost many days of work. There is no a clear regulation that says that the employer has to pay or have to pay the workers, and as a result of that, hundreds of workers were left without any wage, any salary, and still a few workers are in Kelowna, in the Okanagan area, without being paid. And so many of them suffer as well, because after a few weeks after a few days of the fire, many of them were returned to Guatemala and Mexico, and without any pay. And also we have been facing the air quality situation, lots of smoke going on in different regions in British Columbia, and with the workers being exposed because there's no provision of personal protective equipment for that situation. And also during the winter time, with the climate change, they are also suffering. But most of the climate change is the nature of the program where they are coming, because this program has been built based on not providing rights for the workers, has been built on basically making agricultural migrant workers in a situation where they don't have the possibility of permanent residence. We consider migrant workers people with precarious immigration status because they come with a working permit that ties them to only one employer. And for sure, if they ask the employer for something, if they raise their concerns, their voice, they won't come back next year. This is a situation happening in all British Columbia, in all Canada. Then when we see the next steps, and with this climate change, what the first thing that come to our mind is our demand for job security. Agricultural migrant workers, because they are coming with a working permit that is tied to only one employer, they don't have job security during climate situations like this year, the fire, for example. Hundreds of them lost their jobs. There is no job security. They came for 2 years working permit. They work a couple weeks. Then the fire happened. They were displaced. They were sent back to their country without any recognition of their time. And no one takes responsibility for that. The federal government is not making the necessary changes, and the provincial government is sleeping on this topic. And we don't see the participation of the provincial government in providing solutions to the job security of the migrant workers. Then we have also, I was talking to you about the financial impact when they expend thousands of dollars on the possibility of coming to Canada, where they suffer extortions in their country of origin, and they suffer extortion in this country. In Canada, they suffer extortions. 2 or 3 weeks ago, in my tour to Grand Forks, I met with a group of workers. They were very happy with the situation with their employers. Some of the employers were even supporting them to bring their families. But another group of workers came to our activity, and this group of workers came to our meeting, and they said that because they were with precarious immigration status, the employer has been paying them $4 an hour. $4 an hour in 2023. $11 an hour in Queremeos. Every employer in Queremeos is paying $11 an hour. That is very sad. Angers me. And what we are asking also is to the politicians, to the elected members of the parliament, is listen to what we are saying. We have been proposing for years a regularization program to provide a status for everyone, permanent residence upon arrival for workers. The only solution to start talking about climate change, to start talking about job security and all of this, and respecting the rights of workers, is having at least the permanent residence where we can have a voice, where people can have a voice. And then, in terms of health and safety, this is a big call for the provincial government. They need to solidify a team of the provincial government to pay attention to agricultural migrant workers. They are not doing their job right now. They need to meet with us. They need to provide the conditions for the workers to have voice, the conditions for workers to be able to denounce what is happening, and no change at the federal level, no change at the provincial level must happen without the voice of the First Nations and our voice as workers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Byron. It's always such an honor to hear you speak. And as someone I think in the chat pointed out, this is often not talked about on kind of the forefront of climate and labor discussions. And I think really speaks, if I may, to the responsibility on us in the labor movement and those of us that are in unions to really spotlight regularization as a priority because these workers are otherwise, really left behind, and like you said, displacement and family separation. So thank you so much. I always find your words so moving. So I will just introduce our next panelist here. I hope that I'm pronouncing your name right. Please correct me if I'm not. Ivan Drury-Zarin is a Handy-Dart paratransit driver and member of the ATU Local 1724. Ivan lives on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations in East Vancouver. He is a sympathizing member of the US-based socialist organization Solidarity and the editor of A Separate Star, which is a book on revolutionary socialist politics and strategy published this summer by ARP Books, which is very exciting. So welcome, Ivan. I'll pass it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to read in order to try to hold to my time. So I want to begin by acknowledging I like Byron, I'm also calling in from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, and there can be no justice on these lands so long as they remain occupied by the settler colonial state of Canada. A just transition must begin with the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous nations for social and economic development. And thank you, Chris, and the Council of Canadians for inviting me to speak on this panel. And thank you, Cassidy, for chairing, and to other speakers for your work presenting here. I think so far it's very challenging perspectives that are, I think, complementary and also maybe raise some difficulties. But I'm speaking as a Handy-Dart paratransit driver and a member of the Amalgamated Transit Union, ATU Local 1724, but I'm not speaking as a representative of my union and certainly not of Handy-Dart. While I'm trying to reflect my experiences as a driver, which are inevitably similar to the experiences of other drivers, I am alone responsible for my analysis and conclusions. So this presentation, I'm going to argue that fair, free, widespread, accessible public transit is fundamental to a just transition from fossil-fueled capitalism. A term I'm going to refer to throughout this short talk is social reproduction, or just reproduction, by which I mean the unwaged labor that all workers have to do when they're off work in order to reproduce the workforce. This is historically and still is the province primarily of unwaged women workers in the home. Workers must reproduce their own energies constantly to return to work each day, and also must reproduce the working class by creating new generations of workers. Maybe we'll hear my baby son crying in the background while my partner Stacy is doing the reproductive work of caring for him so I can do this presentation. So thanks to her as well, although she's not listening to me. The way transit is currently organized serves the interests of bosses who need access to low-wage workers. The default expectation remains that the responsibility and the cost of transit is offloaded to individual workers who commute to work on public roads, but in vehicles that they pay for through a portion of their wages. In Metro Vancouver, the 2016 census found that only 20.4% of commuters travel by public transit, with 59.6% traveling by their personal vehicles. Roads remain oriented to use by private vehicles. We can think of these roads as public subsidies for privatized reproduction as workers continue to bear the cost of moving themselves to work. Canada's current plan for a transition to electrified forms of transportation broadly keep this standard intact. The government of British Columbia offers a $4,000 rebate for the private purchase of a personal electric vehicle and is investing $26 million this year alone in creating electric charging stations for personal electric vehicles. Meanwhile, HandyDART buses all run on gas or diesel. Our job providing accessible public transportation to people with disabilities and elders often means picking up and driving a very small number of passengers, sometimes just one person, all the way across town. You would think that electrifying the HandyDART fleet would be a high priority for a government that claims to be interested in introducing a greener economy in society. But the priority remains to accommodate a turn from a privatized commuter system based on the use of personal vehicles that run on gas to the same system but run on electricity. Besides maintaining the transfer of transportation costs from the capitalist society as a whole to the individual worker, this plan also continues the problem that this capitalist society is destroying the planet by mining and logging and stealing indigenous lands globally, but with fewer emissions. Electrifying public transit is one obviously necessary step in a just transition, but not if we don't also make transit fare-free, well-organized, dependable, and universally accessible. The benefits of having buses and trains run on time and on regular, dependable schedules are obvious. It would mean that you would know when the bus is coming and you would be therefore more likely to use it. But a chronic lack of funding breaks the public transportation system and makes it feel like a punishment to use it. Onboard HandyDART buses, the most common complaint I hear from passengers is that they have to wait a terribly long time for a bus. Oftentimes, these are regular passengers who take the bus to and from the hospital for dialysis treatments 3 times a week. When the bus is late taking them to the hospital and picking them up after, it turns this regular appointment from a 4-hour appointment in a hospital bed into an 8-hour trip, consuming their entire day. It's not uncommon for me to hear that someone finished their dialysis treatment and then waited 2 hours for their bus ride home. The reason that people have to wait for HandyDART buses for too long is that there are not enough buses on the road. This system of public transit is also privatized, and at multiple levels. TransLink contracts out the operation of HandyDART to Transdev, a private French corporation that has made its fortune privatizing transit throughout Europe. The less Transdev spends on buses, the more of the money it receives from TransLink it gets to keep for its shareholders. So privatization forms the logic for Transdev putting fewer buses on the road and subcontracting more and more to private taxis. 10 years ago, about 6% of HandyDART runs were subcontracted to taxis. Today, it's over 20%. But higher fares are not the solution to the problem of underfunding and austerity logic in the transit system. At HandyDART, I think fare collection does not add a dime to the budget of operating the buses. The cost benefit of the Compass card system and fare collection generally is a matter of contention in the TransLink system. It cost $194 million to set up the Compass system, which was finally launched in 2015. And in 2022, TransLink announced it cost another $216 million to upgrade the system. Add this to the more than $35 million a year that the TransLink spends policing transit fares, and it costs about $690 million between 2015 and 2023, or about $98 million a year to collect fares in the Metro Vancouver transit system, which amounts to about a quarter of the money collected through fares in that same time. For HandyDART, the question of whether there is a positive revenue stream from fare collection should not even be a question at all. Ridership on HandyDART is a tiny fraction of overall transit ridership, and riders access an individually specialized service, like I said, often with a single rider on board a bus for a long distance. Not all the time, but often enough. For HandyDART, the idea that a $2 or $3 fare covers any portion of the trip is laughable. In many cases, the cost of the time required for a passenger to fish out their Compass card or count out their change probably exceeds the amount of money collected from their fare. So why collect fares on HandyDart at all? What's the purpose? The answer to that is that while HandyDart fares don't mean much to the operator, Transdev, they do often mean a lot to many riders. Most regular HandyDart riders are regulars because they have equally regular medical appointments, often their 3 times a week trip to a dialysis clinic, for example. Say that costs them $3.10 per trip. That's $6.30 a day, $75.60 a month. For someone on regular social assistance, that's 14% of their $560 monthly support check in the unlikely event that they don't spend all of their allotted support monies on rent. I make a practice of asking riders what their fares mean to them, and most of them tell me it means they don't take HandyDart outside of those mandatory trips. They can't afford it. I tell them that some riders use HandyDart to go to the beach or the bar. One young woman told me that would be nice, but for her, it's out of reach. In practice, the effect of collecting fares is to reduce ridership. The BC Disability Bus Pass, which allows people on disability welfare to ride all other transit in BC fare-free, is not accepted on HandyDart. You have to ask if a fare system is in fact a strategy by the operator to reduce ridership. Eliminating fares on HandyDart would therefore increase ridership. Increasing ridership by eliminating fares on HandyDart would benefit HandyDart clients by increasing their mobility, improving their access to recreational and social events, and opening access to parks, beaches, and the natural world. Increasing ridership would also be in the interest of HandyDart workers by putting and keeping more buses on the road and improving our workplace atmosphere with a more diverse set of destinations and a happier set of more fulfilled riders. Who wants their shift to be an endless ferrying of frustrated people to hospitals and dialysis clinics? I know my preference is to take old timers to the Ivanhoe Bar. Our current privatized transportation system offloads the responsibility for the reproduction of workers' energy to workers themselves. A fare-free, public, just transportation system of electrified transit is an example of how our society can take the burden of social reproduction off women in the privatized domestic sphere, whether that's transporting their children to school or ferrying elders to medical appointments, and relieving workers of the drain on our wages as we're compelled to pay for our passage to work. We could do this by socializing reproduction. By socializing the cost of transportation with good quality, accessible, fare-free public transit, workers would also reduce our cost of living and would therefore be able to work less, increasing our free time, which we could then use more productively because we could take this good public transit to visit friends, get involved in community struggles, go to the beach, mountains, and the bar. The principle I want to insist on that should be a guide for just transition to public transit is to center electrified, fare-free public transit, abandoning the failed and exploitative model of publicly subsidized private transit. I don't have any hope that policymakers operating under the current system can or will implement such a turn away from privatized to socialized reproduction. For a glimpse of what's possible, I look instead to the knowledge and cooperation of my coworkers on the buses and then in the dispatch centers, and to the members of communities I see every day, those I transport on the bus and their loved ones. The CEO of Transdev in France does not know or care what transit would look like in Metro Vancouver. The ones who already know what just transit systems mean are the drivers, dispatch operators, and the communities that make this transit system work today, despite the privatized constraints. We do this together, we do it cooperatively, but we do it without formal organization or structural power. It's that organization and power that we need in order to build a just transit system in a just world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ivan. I appreciate all of your words, but especially connecting community health and happiness with climate justice and how that affects your job. That was just wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to looking into the book that you edited this summer. So I will introduce our next speaker, Mike Fancy. Mike is a wildland fire officer who has been employed by the Yukon government for 5 fire seasons. Like many of his coworkers, he's passionate about the outdoors, so he believes in the need for an energy transition that would reduce the impacts of human-caused climate change. So over to you, Mike.
Hi, everybody. I hope you're having a lovely evening. Like Cassidy said, my name is Mike. I'm calling in today from the traditional territory of the Kwanlundun First Nation and the Ta'an Quachin Council. There are final agreements that have been signed with both of these First Nations that are fairly unique and advanced. And today they make me think of folks in the Gaza Strip who do not have the opportunity for these types of agreements or discussions, and who find themselves increasingly homeless or, in other cases, injured or dead. So I work in the wildfire sector, and I'm employed by the government's wildfire response agency. I'm a member of the Yukon Employees Union, which is a component of the PSAC. And I just want to start by saying that the experiences that we have in the Yukon are sometimes different from the ones that people have in BC or in Alberta when it comes to wildfires, just because of the place that we live, our population density, and a number of other vagaries. But I'd like to start by asking, like, if people could just quickly make a quick, either a comment, a reaction, a post in the chat, if you were, or you know someone who was impacted by a wildfire evacuation, an alert, an evacuation order over the course of this past summer, whatever you want that notification to be. Yeah, there's a couple of us. And I think that speaks to how impactful the consequences of climate change are to not just me and the people who I work with in the wildfire sector, but the consequences of our performance in doing our jobs as climate change starts to sink in, right? And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But I wanted to just highlight that fact before we get any deeper, in case it seems as though I'm starting to spiral off into the abyss with some of the problems that I face in the workplace. Our response season in the Yukon generally starts in about May and lasts until sometime in mid-August or September. We'll have, if we have flooding in the territory, that will generally happen in the spring. And our wildfires will be at their most active in mid-June to about mid-August. I manage a team of 3 people responsible for dealing with public interactions with stakeholders, with mayors, First Nation chiefs and executive directors. And occasionally over the course of that summer season, my staff team can balloon to up to about 6 people. During my first season, our work was overwhelmingly focused on wildfire response in 2019. And now we spend much more of our time and our resources developing and leading community safety initiatives, like local protection plans, more defensive prevention work around communities, while supporting other emergencies with the expertise that we have based on the fact that we're expected to be at responses on a yearly basis. So we've developed those skills and we're called on to help. Our workplace is changing a lot because of climate change. I think it starts with the increased expectation that we're going to continue to be able to respond as wildfire seasons get longer and more severe, and continue to pitch in as incident experts, like I mentioned, as things like floods become a more frequent occurrence when the snow starts to melt and it starts to overwhelm other types of emergency organizations in the territory. We've been successful finding money to pay for longer fire seasons for some of our staff. And it's great. I think, like in British Columbia, the BC Wildfire Service has started hiring full-time firefighters who work 12 months a year. But the fact of the matter is that not all of our staff want that either. Excuse me. We have a high turnover workforce at the ground level, and a lot of our folks are university and school and college aged, and they want to return to their post-secondary education in September. And so those extensions or those longer fire seasons might not be something they want, regardless of whether we have the money or the political willpower to make them available. And so the lasting impact that climate change has made on my work is that these extreme weather events are making wildfires and floods more numerous and severe. And I want to start by talking about how it's not necessarily hot weather itself that's causing these fires. We can have, massive heat domes like the one that sat over the Lower Mainland 2 years ago. But there needs to be a spark that starts those fires. In the Yukon, for example, this year we had a really, really lovely hot start to the summer. But the lightning that causes the majority of our fires didn't take place until, for the second year in a row, this massive honking lightning storm passed over the territory and rained absolute havoc on the landscape for about 2 weeks and just totally stretched our capacity thin. We know that this lightning has been a part of the landscape in the forest since before humans set foot in the Yukon, right? Like fire and the boreal forest are two peas in a pod. But when these lightning storms become as intense as they do, that stretches our capacity, and that intensity is caused by climate change. That's the challenge that we're facing. And we've had to deal with that for 2 years in a row now. It's the volume. And on their own, like if this lightning storm was sitting like over the mountains in between NWT and the Yukon, that wouldn't necessarily be a problem for us either, because of the important ecological relationship between fire and the forest that maintains that succession. But when wildfires strike beside communities, when we're unlucky and those lightning storms land in the places that we have chosen to build communities, right, in the middle of the boreal forest, that's when we start having our long days. And those long days have become more frequent and more challenging for me, for crews, for our officers, and for the public who depend on us to solve the problems that Mother Nature is throwing at us. And so I'm mainly concerned about the impacts that are compounding, right? So I noticed in the chat, somebody mentioned talking about smoke density. And that's a real and awful impact of wildfires. Other impacts like highway closures that limit people's travel. Yeah, John Viant is dope. Yes, I have the chat open already. Things like wildfire smoke, like highway closures, like direct fire threat that can prompt evacuations, to critical infrastructure integrity like internet and electricity and gas supply. All of these things, as caused by fire, happening more often and happening at the same time. And that's making our workforce's jobs very difficult. The increased work tempo, importantly, is also contributing to an increased number of workplace injuries, right? There were multiple wildfire fatalities this summer in the West, in BC and in Alberta and in NWT. Thankfully, nobody died in the Yukon. And that's the bar. I'm thankful that nobody died. There were injuries, but, there were fatalities caused by both fire suppression activities and related work. And that is also something that we have to contend with, is the increased safety risks caused by busier fire seasons. Here in the Yukon, when things are happening like this, we can usually also lean on larger agencies down south to lend us resources. This is a reasonable and normal thing where we kind of trade so that we don't all have to have a terrific number of firefighters in our agencies all the time, so that, if BC is heating up, we can send staff to BC and help out. And then they come back, and when we need help, BC can send us folks. I was sent to Alberta at the beginning of the summer, and I worked in Yellowhead County. And then I came back and our fire season started to happen, but things were still happening in Alberta. Things were still happening in BC. And so when we needed that extra support, when we were trying to find the resources we would normally count on, they weren't really there as much as they have been in the past. And we had to dig really deep to find crews and support staff and helicopters to help us do our job to the standard that the public expect of us. And so like the public, for that matter, as all of these things are unfolding, have to deal with the fact that this is in the news. And that has an impact on our relationship with the public. Because when you see a news thread that talks about all of the wildfires in BC, all the wildfires in Alberta, all the wildfires in NWT and in Quebec and in Halifax, like it weighs on us. It creates disaster fatigue. When you hear that people you know in those places are being evacuated, when we have to think about whether we're prepared, it really starts to drain. And that in some cases has made our jobs more difficult too, because people have gotten a little twitchy about seeing things like smoke, seeing things like forest management work, and the work that we're trying to do to protect the community from wildfire risk is actually in some cases being met with resistance, because people are just too scared of fire to see how sometimes, we use fire for preventative work. And then we're fighting a campaign on two fronts where we're trying to fight the fire. Sometimes we're also trying to fight communities to remind them that we are able to do some proactive work, some preventative work, and convince people that it's necessary. In the future, I expect that we're going to be challenged interpersonally in more of these ways, like we saw as people were displaced in Yellowknife, in Kelowna, and in Alberta. We had to actually evacuate 2 communities this summer. It was the first time we've done that in such a volume. And I think eventually it's going to happen again. And this wrinkle is a new dynamic for us because we have to do more planning to be better prepared, to make sure that people are provided for when these evacuations caused by more intense wildfire seasons are going to force people from their homes. It's hard. It's really hard. And so, when I hope for myself and my colleagues and my community in the future, I know that when push comes to shove, people are going to expect that we will be able to do our jobs and we will be able to put our best foot forward to protect communities and to protect people's lives and to protect each other as responders when lives or when homes are on the line, regardless of climate change, regardless of the tools that we're using. During a fire season, people just want to see us keep the community safe. And when I think about a clean energy transition, and I think about like the terrific amounts of petroleum product that we use in our workplace, I try to imagine how we would get around those things. Our aviation program, our helicopters, we need those things to do our jobs. Most of our trucks, especially our fire engines, are still combustion engines, even if we're dipping our toes in electric vehicles. The means by which we move water are pumps, our drip torches, the tool that we use to burn off. Both of those need fuel and oil in some cases. And our remote fire camps, right, where we have to serve hundreds of people food, dry out gear, wash clothes, keep lights on, all that stuff is powered by generators. And so when I think about people saying like, we need to reduce our carbon footprint, like I look around our warehouse and I ask like, well, how do we do that here? And like, how do we reduce our impact without compromising our ability to do our jobs? It's a very difficult question that I struggle with. And so thinking ahead, like whether we do those things in society or not right now, more intense weather, more extreme weather events, these things are already happening. And so I think that we've sort of missed the boat on the chance to prevent more intense fire seasons, at least in the short term. I think we've missed the boat in how we can prevent more intense fire seasons, at least in the short term. And so we need to continue doing what I think we're doing really well in the Yukon. So that's an investment in like robust community protection and thinking about ways that we can be proactive in trying to reduce risk. Individuals have a role to play in this as much as governments, but I think as governments, we need to continue our upward trajectory in ramping up the projects, ramping up the plans, working with communities to make sure that these plans are in place before the fire. I think that we need elected representatives who are open to these discussions and who are willing to acknowledge that human-caused climate change is a thing. And expanding our capacity to manage these complex fire seasons. As it stands right now, our work shift will look like this. You show up for your day and you have your normal day. If your shift goes well, you do like your 5 or 7 day shift, normal hours, and then you take your days off. You'll take 2 days off at least. If the fire season's really busy, then those days get longer. And we have a rule that says that we need to be down, like you need to be like supine on the ground, sleeping or trying to sleep for at least 8 hours. But that still means that sometimes we're doing 12, 14, 16-hour days. And we don't like the 16-hour days, but it's very likely that you'll run into a firefighter somewhere, absolutely, who has worked up to 19 12-hour days in a row. That's our work limit. 19 days on, 2 days off, very long days. And for the firefighters, very physical days. And so those are the work conditions in which we're managing complex fire seasons. We need more staff so that we can start drawing down some of these fatigue challenges, because not only does it push people away, I think that it's just a lot. It's a lot on your body and it's a lot on your mind. And so these resources are really important to us, to have enough people so that we're not working ourselves too hard. And we receive a lot of attention in the summer at my job. The leader's intent is super clear during busy fire seasons. You hear from cabinet ministers all the time about the work that we're doing, especially when communities are threatened, especially when communities are evacuated and people are displaced. At the end of the day, here's the thing I want from our political leadership is to continue listening when our agencies say that we need these human resources. We need these financial resources during the winter after the fire season has ended, when we're trying to act on what we learned over the summer. Ultimately, that's the thing. Like if we don't have the tools to do our job, we're still going to try our best to do our jobs, and it'll come at a cost. It comes at a cost. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Mike, for your insights as a worker on the front lines of the climate crisis. And just super quickly, want to give appreciation to Mike and the earlier speakers who either verbally or non-verbally with their keffiyehs in the background, who showed solidarity for Palestinians. I always fall back on the responsibility of organized labor because it's what I know, but there really is a call for us to bring this to our unions to amplify the call for international solidarity for Palestine as union members and really all of us in the social justice movement. So thank you again for bringing that up. And I will pass it over, I believe, to Chris for a moment to invite us to take action to ensure that the voices and expertise of workers is represented in our transition planning. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, Cassidy. And thanks so much to all of the workers who spoke this evening. So really quickly, before we get into just a really short Q&A, respecting the time that we have left, we want to just share a couple of calls to action that you can take right now to demand that workers are put in positions where they are able to determine what that transition will look like for themselves and their communities. So the first piece of that is an action letter that we at the Council of Canadians have up around the Sustainable Jobs Act. So as you may know, the Sustainable Jobs Act was proposed earlier this year as a way to start putting together mechanisms to transition folks out of high carbon jobs into a sustainable energy future. And so that letter was that piece of legislation was just referred to committee. And so that committee is made up of a lot of different MPs from across the country who will be proposing amendments to that sustainable jobs legislation that will kind of lay the groundwork for what our transition is going to look like. And we have some really key suggested amendments that come from the environmental movement, that come from the labor movement, to ensure that that legislation is strong enough to benefit workers and communities. So we would encourage you to take action at the letter that David just dropped in the chat. So send that to the committee members to ensure that they are ensuring that that sustainable jobs legislation has better worker representation and more opportunities for workers to be participants and stakeholders in that transition planning. The second letter that we'll drop in the chat that you can take action on immediately is through the Worker Solidarity Network. And it's a letter that you can send to decision makers to demand open work permits, full regularization, and emergency EI benefits to migrant workers who are feeling the impacts of that the climate crisis that Byron spoke to so well earlier today. So we'll have a couple more opportunities to take action after a little bit more discussion with our panelists. For now, you can check out those letters in the chat. You can send them right now to those folks, and I'll turn it back to Cassidy to facilitate just a very quick Q&A with our panelists.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so I have a question to kick off some inter-panelist discussion if folks are ready. The question is, what questions do you have for the other panelists about their work and their hopes for their sectors? So if anyone wants to kick that off.
Well, I can maybe make a few comments. I found Ivan's presentation to be quite interesting in regards to the potential impact of not charging for ridership. I first kind of was exposed to that when I took my boy down to Portland for hockey. And I found that all their transportation, at least the stuff that I was using, was all free. And I found that to be kind of unique and never really thought much more about it afterwards. But I think it certainly would, in the interest of global warming, it has the potential of, reducing the private cars on the roads and this sort of stuff. My question to Ivan would be, do you have any information that would sort of inform us that free ridership on public transportation actually does result in that, or is it simply more the people that would ride the transportation system anyways just get a free ride? Now, does it actually compel people to park the car, sell the car, and hop on public transportation because it's free?
Cassidy, should I just go ahead? Or do you want to take a few questions and then what do you want to do?
I think maybe just so it's fresh in everybody's mind, if you want to just jump right into it. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, so just briefly, I don't have them on hand, but studies, particularly in European cities, of correlations between ridership and cost of fares or free fares boosting ridership. But I think a point that Eric Doherty, who's on this call, is more of a specialist around transit policy than me, who's written reports for Amalgamated Transit Union and other transit organizations on the ways to reform transit in a useful direction for ridership. His point that making transit fast, opening up lanes, stopping highway expansion and redirecting that money to transit, basically reorganizing the system, like I was saying, away from publicly subsidized private transit, actually a full public system. That kind of whole package is what it would take to really boost ridership. People don't only avoid taking buses because they cost money; they also avoid it because they're not dependable when they show up, and they're slow. So if they're tied up in the same traffic as cars, then people are less likely to take it. But if there's a dedicated bus lane and the buses move consistently through the city, no matter the time of day, that's going to push people onto transit and be a real motivation. So I think the fare-free aspect is a a part of it. And I'm particularly from the Handy Dart perspective, I think that's really critical. But in an overall transit system, we need to see a kind of total policy shift from publicly subsidized private transportation to one that emphasizes public transportation as the core of how people get around. And then I think we would see a turn in how people approach that. Basically, buses have to be clean and comfortable and fast, as well as free.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ivan. And I think Mike had his hand up for a question there.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I wanted to like describe how a universal bus pass at the university that I went to had an impact on ridership. We organized and we had to fight the transit company quite hard to implement a bus pass. It took several years and some pretty hard negotiations, but we got there. But once we were able to do so, after the first year, at one university, we were able to drop about 15% of cars out of the parking lot in 1 year. So, you know, looking at least 1 in 10 people who chose to get on the bus instead of getting in their car in 1 year, it was a pretty remarkable sea change as like far as here's the first year of the project, and this is how quickly attitudes had changed. I really value these opportunities because I think that when we talk about larger communities and free transport, it's one thing, but up north, like in a 35,000 person town with lots of subdivisions, you know, you as a worker, you have to have a way to get to work. And if the bus doesn't even run on Sunday, like we have tried to make transit free in Whitehorse, like Ivan said, and something different happened for the same reasons that he flagged. The bus routes are confusing to navigate. They run at inconvenient times. There aren't enough of them. And so if you have to be at work, you're going to do what you need to do to get to work, regardless of whether transit is free or not. And I think that those are two really interesting and different stories that do a really good job of illustrating the reasons why Ivan is talking about these things as being necessary preconditions.
Thanks, Mike. So we'll go over to Ivan and then Byron. I think Ivan may be frozen there. Byron, do you want to go ahead with your question and we can circle back to Ivan after?
Thank you. And Mike, I would like to ask you a question. Is there any consideration of translating some of the materials that you might have in terms of emergency preparedness? For example, I'm just imagining in terms of the agricultural migrant workers in very isolated places in British Columbia, and they don't have any materials that help them when they have to evacuate the communities. They don't know what's going on, and then this must be something that could be beneficial.
Absolutely. I think that you're totally right. Like information only works if it can be received. And it's something that we do locally with regards to our French-speaking community. Yukon is an English-French bilingual territory. And so most of the things that we produce are translated into French. The homeowner's manual that we provide people to learn about how to reduce risk, for example, which contains an evacuation plan, it's printed English and French, you flip it over. I mean, I can raise that issue with my peers in the BC Wildfire Service. I think that it's important because if emergency information isn't available in someone's language of choice, then it can't be consumed. The limitations you run into, though, are access to translation services and how long they take. Wildfires happen at inconvenient hours of the day. Usually most of the bad things happen around supper time or in the evening. And so like our government translator services are on standby. They don't have people in their office. And so the emergency information, there's often a lag, and that makes it more difficult to provide. I think that if there are products like pamphlets, information about what to expect, how to prepare, that stuff can definitely be translated ahead of time. But it's all about the resources that are available to get the translating done, especially at weird hours of the day.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. Okay, I think Ivan is back there. If you had your question, Ivan?
Yeah, I'm sorry, my internet blinking out. I have questions for each person, but I think maybe I wanted to ask Byron. Your presentation made me think about the international dimension of just transition and how climate change is both really radically further dividing the world between people who are heavily affected by climate change immediately and people who have some relative security from it, and also bringing people into collision with each other. I guess I'm thinking about people fleeing global climate catastrophe in the global south, and trying to migrate to Canada and other countries in the global north. I wonder if what you think about the relationship between Canada's immigration system and temporary foreign worker system and this international climate disaster, if we can think about migration policy as part of a response to climate change.
Thanks, Ivan. Yeah, very important question. And definitely we are seeing a direct impact on what is happening in the South. And also the migrant workers program or the temporary workers program. On one side, we know that Canada has this program, and this program is based on exploiting people. It's based on paying minimum wage to everyone, right? Then, first of all, we need to secure that everyone coming has the right to get permanent residence, because that's the only way to secure some rights. And at the same time, when I was talking about the regularization program, we definitely think that the regularization program, when we are asking for a status for everyone, it's for everyone, definitely, because we are seeing the impact of refugees coming from everywhere, right? That is not necessarily escaping from an immediate army or from the soldiers immediately, but they are basically being already victims of climate change, and also all the consequences of the transnationals, the mining companies, and things like that. Then we own something to these people. We own something to them, because Canada is responsible for what's happening everywhere right now. It's responsible for what's happening in Guatemala right now. It's responsible for what's happening in Colombia right now. It's also responsible for what's happening in Gaza right now. Then we have some responsibility towards people who are coming here, and regularization must involve refugees, must involve also caregivers, must involve migrant workers who are coming to the agricultural sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Byron. I think we are out of time for questions, but that was so great. I feel like I have a million more questions for each of you. But we have to jump into a few more calls to action. So I just have a couple of things to say just on behalf of Worker Solidarity Network. So we're campaigning on the demands we've heard from workers through our Climate Labor Project. So we're demanding for enforced health and safety regulations and action on heat in the workplace, while also doing emergency response mobilization to migrant workers affected by climate events. So to that end, we have the 2 letters we'd encourage you all to sign on to. And we also have an organizing call tomorrow at 6 p.m. For our Worker Wednesday to help turn that climate grief and climate rage into climate action. So I believe that the registration link for that will be in the chat. So I'll be there. Please join us. And I will turn it back over to Chris.
Awesome. Thanks, Cassidy. Yeah, just another quick call to action, or information rather. We have a little bit of information from one of our other co-sponsors this evening, or our co-hosts this evening, Wilderness Committee, around the BC Climate Emergencies campaign and their Just Transition Working Group and its work. So we'll also drop a link in the chat to that, so you can get a little bit more information about what that group is up to. We'll also share again the letter that we had mentioned from Council of Canadians around demanding our decision makers make good amendments to the Sustainable Jobs Act as it continues to move through the legislative process. We'll also be in touch with everyone after this webinar. We're going to take these stories and perspectives from these different workers and figure out how to use them to continue to put pressure on decision makers. I really appreciated the demands around regularization and ensuring status for all, and good working conditions for migrant workers, the demands of employers around ensuring good union jobs as decarbonization occurs, to decision makers around what folks are hoping to see in terms of funding for their different sectors, and also especially Ivan, your call beyond our decision makers, looking to our communities and to each other as we move through this transition, and making sure that we're listening to and supporting each other and building the world that we want to see. So we'll be in touch, folks. Thank you so much for spending your evening with us. Thank you again to our panelists. So thank you, Ivan Drury. Thank you, Cliff Madsen. Thank you, Byron Cruz. And thank you, Mike Fancy, for your time and your words this evening. I also want to thank Cassidy Crow for being such a killer host tonight. Thank you for your wisdom, the way that you moved us through this conversation. And then also just really quickly, a thanks to the Workers' Solidarity Network and Wilderness Committee for making tonight possible. Again, we're the Council of Canadians. If you're interested in more conversations like this, we'll be having conversations with workers across the country in different regions. You're able to find all of that out on our website as we announce those things. And we'd also pitch that you become a member for $1 a year to continue being a part of these conversations and taking action around climate justice issues like a just transition. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and we'll be in touch with further opportunities for action. So have a really wonderful evening.
Thank you. No change without us.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Byron. Thanks, everyone.
See you later.
Bye.